Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Megan Clark here at St. John's University. I am in the theology department and the faculty co-chair of our St. John's CRS Global Campus Committee. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you and all who will watch this on YouTube to learn from Elizabeth Boyle about what it's like to negotiate peace in South Sudan. As is our practice, we'll begin with a brief prayer. In this case, a prayer for peace from CAFOD, which is the UK's version of Catholic Relief Services. It is the British member of Caritas Internationalis. And then I will turn it over to Ms. Boyle, and then we will have a couple of students who will join us on camera at the end in order to facilitate discussion. And so as we begin, loving God, pour out your peace upon us all. Lead us in your ways, united with our brothers and sisters throughout the world. Hear our prayer, especially for the people of South Sudan. Fill them with hope and strengthen their commitment as they come together to seek reconciliation, build peace, understanding, and trust. Work through your people to break down the barriers that prevent change. Melt the mistrust that divides and calm the fears that lead to violence. And unite us all in our desire for peace so that everyone may live free from conflict, hunger, and injustice, and all may flourish as one human family. Amen. We have with us today Ms. Elizabeth Boyle, who is the Vice President for Peace Initiatives and Research at the Sant-Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue. She was also the Project Director for South Sudan. She previously worked for Religions for Peace, USAID, the U.S. Department of State, and did both her undergraduate and her graduate work at the University of Notre Dame. And so it is my absolute pleasure, and I should say we are both collaborators on a committee and initiative for the Catholic Peace Building Network, which is where I had the pleasure of getting to know her a little bit. And so it is my pleasure to virtually welcome you to St. John's and to ask you to share with us a little bit about how you got into this work and a bit more on your work in negotiating peace in South Sudan and the work of Sant-Egidio more broadly.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for tuning in to this. As Megan mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Boyle, and though I'm currently calling from Rome, Italy, I am a New Yorker at heart. I grew up on Long Island, so being able to join you all in the St. John's community makes me really feel at home, even if the distance is rather far. So I'm grateful to be here with all of you. As Megan said, I did both my undergraduate and my master's degree at the University of Notre Dame. And for both degrees, I studied in the International Peace Studies concentration at the Kroc Institute. And since I was rather little, I always felt this pull towards doing work for peace. I didn't know what that would manifest itself as and look like when I was younger, and I'm still working to figure out what that means. But for me, I always felt that my desire to work in peace was more of a vocation, less than a job. That is something I felt I was wholeheartedly being called towards, and that I wanted to make the reason for my life and for what I do. So I studied that at Notre Dame and was lucky enough to not only do internships during the summer and during my time there, but I also had the chance to study the intersection of religion, conflict, and violence. Growing up in New York during September 11th and in the aftermath, I really felt that there was a lot we had to understand about our neighbors and about how both religions can be a conduit for great peace, but also can be manipulated for violent reasons, and that we need to dispel a lot of the narratives we have been taught. And so as a part of Notre Dame's Madrasa Discourses program, I had the opportunity to travel to Oman, Qatar, and Nepal to study alongside of traditional madrasa scholars from India and Pakistan, and to really learn more about not only the Islamic faith, but also my own faith and what it means to live in interfaith and intercultural settings, with this idea that we're all working for peace being the motive that grounds us all. And so it was out of this research and this work that I knew I wanted to continue pursuing peace building and peace studies at Notre Dame. And while I was doing my master's at Notre Dame, through mentors within the Catholic Peace Building Network, I came in contact with the community of Sant-Egidio. And for some of you, this might be the first time you're hearing about Sant-Egidio. You might have seen it in a newspaper once or read it in a book. But for those of you who haven't heard about it, allow me to share a brief introduction of what the community is. Very simply, the community, as Pope Francis has referred to us as, is the community of the three P's: peace, prayer, and poor. It's a movement, a lay movement in the Catholic Church that was founded by a group of high schoolers in Rome in the late 1960s. And it's important to remember that during that time, you had both the emergence of Vatican II and a student-led protest movement in universities in Italy and throughout Europe called the Sessantotto. In the midst, you had these group of students here in Rome who felt called by Vatican II to really step into leadership roles as lay people, but the template for what that looked like was not yet drawn. It had not been written. No one had done that experience before. And at the other hand, though they were inspired by the advocacy of their peers, they also didn't fully align themselves with all of the tactics that their peers were using in the Sessantotto movement. And so these students very simply felt that what was missing in their life was putting the gospel into action. I think a lot of times, especially those of us who've been fortunate enough to have a Catholic education, you're steeped in reading the gospel and learning about it and studying it in theology classes. But I wonder how often we've ever really been challenged to walk and live and put the gospel into action. And so these students tried to do just that. And before school every morning, they would reflect on the gospel and the passage of that day, and they would preach amongst themselves. This was lay young people preaching, trying to ask, how do we put this gospel into the day we're about to have? And then the most important charism is that they would then go out to the most marginalized, the most forgotten areas of Rome and be in friendship with the poor. In the beginning, that looked like service with young kids in a program that we now call the School for Peace. And very simply, these high schoolers had realized that there were a lot of children who were living in great abandonment, social isolation, coming from families that had experienced a lot of violence or deep poverty. And they simply needed somebody to be there, somebody who could not only help them with their homework and spend time with them, but teach them what it means to live a life of peace, teach them what it means to be loved and to be part of a community. And out of that, these students began encountering the poor of Rome, the elderly folks who were living on their own and who were being left behind, the great community of folks experiencing homelessness throughout Rome. And little by little, these services of Sant-Egidio developed. But what's important to remember is the word that I mentioned before, which is friendship. And I think sometimes for us in the US, we throw around the idea of friendship, but within Sant-Egidio, it's a really critical word for us, that we are not volunteering our time to the poor, or volunteering with the poor. We are in friendship. One of the greatest compliments that we've received as Sant-Egidio is that oftentimes people say it's difficult to understand who is being served and who is doing the serving when you're with Sant-Egidio. And so these high school students began this community, and it was called the Community of Sant-Egidio. And from Rome, it has now grown to 72 countries with an estimated 80,000 members all over the world, which is quite a big growth from what we could say was 20 or so students here in Rome back in the late 1960s. And I say it's an estimated number because in order to join Sant-Egidio, there's no initiation, there's no membership card. It's simply if you have the desire to build a world of peace and you take seriously the need to be in friendship, gratuitous friendship and community with the poor, with an understanding and deep appreciation for the power of prayer, you are welcome to join. I myself am Catholic and am a member of Sant-Egidio, but the responsible of the community in Central Africa, for example, is Muslim. There's no discrimination on the basis of your religious background, but really if you are a person who is for peace and understands that in order to really live out the gospel call means to actually clothe the naked and feed the homeless, then you are welcome to be a part of Sant-Egidio, whether it be Sant-Egidio in New York, Sant-Egidio in Rome, Sant-Egidio in Belgium. You all are welcome to be a part of the movement. And so this is just to set the ground a little bit of what is this group, this community that you might have heard of before. This might be the first time that you're encountering it. Sant-Egidio has always tried to be attuned to the gospel, and in doing so, be attuned to poverty around the world. The founder of the community, Andrea Riccardi, has a saying that war is the mother of all poverty. That if you can't ameliorate war, if you can't address the root causes of war and conflict, poverty of all sorts are going to continue. When there is conflict, young children can't go to school. You can't access healthcare centers. Transportation and infrastructure collapses. Governance becomes difficult to lead and to try to organize people. And so for Sant-Egidio, our work in a diplomatic space is intricately tied and bound up with our commitment to friendship with the poor. The two are not separate from each other. They are but one and the same. And so as some of you might know, in the 1980s, there was a very violent civil war in Mozambique. Many different international players, including the United States and the UN, were trying to make inroads into a peace agreement, but nothing was really coming to fruition. Now, as I said before, Sant-Egidio takes really seriously this idea of friendship. And so the new bishop of Beira, which is a large city in Mozambique named Jaime Gonzalez, had been coming to Rome. And in coming to Rome, he encountered Sant-Egidio here. But then when he returned back to Mozambique, he also encountered Sant-Egidio there, because we're not a missionary community. Sant-Egidio is started by local members, and it takes on the needs and the contours of the local community, which means that the community in Boston looks very different than the community in Paris, and that looks very different than the community in Bangui. And that's on purpose, because responding to the needs of the poor looks different depending on where you are. And so this bishop grew a coalition, and out of it was able to ask if Sant-Egidio could try to play the role of mediator between Frelimo and Renamo, which were the two sides that were fighting during the Mozambican Civil War. To make a very long story short, after 27 months of negotiation, very confidential, high level, here in Rome, the General Peace Agreement for Mozambique was signed in 1992, and it still stands until today. So now all of a sudden you have this kind of strange conglomeration of Catholics and Christians praying for peace and being with the poor, which has been thrown onto the international stage, is working with the UN, was able to broker a peace agreement. And Sant-Egidio entered into this new chapter of its identity, which is that of trying to be a space for confidential, neutral, trustworthy peacemaking, something that we might call track 2 or perhaps even track 1.5 diplomacy. And this brings me to our story of our engagement in South Sudan. So even though we had engaged in the peace agreement in Mozambique from 1990 to 1992, the community was founded in Mozambique in 1976. So it took a long time for us to get up into that point. Sant-Egidio doesn't have an explicit method of peace building. There's no technical guidebook that you can read to know exactly how to do things the Sant-Egidio way. But there's a couple of key tenets that we try to use to inspire the work that we're doing. And if I could try to synthesize them into 7 things, I would say that they're first, attentiveness to history. You need to understand not only the conflict in the moment in which you're encountering it, but from where it emerged and even before it emerged. How did we get to those moments? How did we get to the tensions that underroot the conflict that we're experiencing now? 2, synergy. At Sant-Egidio, it's a lay movement. It's not the UN. We don't have financial power. We don't have we don't have an army. We don't have a lot of these resources that big governments or international organizations have. And so we need to work hand in hand. For example, the work we do in the Central African Republic, we work with the United Nations to implement their disarmament, disintegration, and disarmament and reintegration strategy, because we have the context on the ground and they have the resources to ensure that the project can be completed. 3 is flexibility, that there's no way, unfortunately, to plan for when conflicts are going to happen and when they will end, and there's a need to always be flexible. A 4th tenet is embracing personal responsibility and this idea of a common future. That for us at Sant-Egidio, what's very important is not that an agreement necessarily is signed. We're never going to force an agreement on a group, nor are we going to force our way into a conflict. But we will enter as mediator if we believe that it will become possible that we can help the group at one side of the table understand that there is no future for them without the group at the other side of the table involved. A 5th tenet is that we're rooted in the point of view of the marginalized, that we're always going to forefront the needs of women, of the elderly, those with disabilities, those who are really most living on the margins, because a true inclusive peace forefronts the voices of those who are often pushed to the back of society. A sixth tenet is that we take a long-term and an individualized approach. We don't set a time limit on our negotiations, and we have the benefit of being able to do that, that we have a history of engaging in this work since the 1980s. We've been engaged in anywhere from 20 to 30 different conflicts since, and we can take this long-term approach for it. And the seventh tenet is that we have been able to build up a reputation of being neutral and trustworthy. And for us, that's perhaps the most powerful currency that you can have, to use that phrase. That if people can trust that they can come to Sant-Egidio to talk about hard things where they can't talk about anywhere else, that's critical. Because I think, unfortunately, we've set up a dichotomy in our world where we think that to pursue the path of violence and war is to be strong, and to pursue the path of peace is to be weak, when quite honestly, it's completely the opposite. Peace is a very dangerous thing. To speak of and to work for peace is something that really the strong are called towards. And if somebody is willing to come to us and to trust us enough to tell them how they are struggling to find peace, we owe to them at the very least our complete trustworthiness, neutrality, and our ability to be there for them and to offer them a space. Because truly it's through dialogue and it's through encountering the other that any inroad for peace can be made. And Sant-Egidio learned this through its friendship with the poor. That you can't just set up a soup kitchen in the middle of your city without knowing who is there, without knowing the struggles that people are going to, and why is it that they're there in the first place, and how can we help people experience a different moment in their lives? How can we help folks get housed or out of nursing homes or whatever that next frontier is? It only comes through encounter. And so that brings me to our engagement in South Sudan. So Sant-Egidio's engagement in South Sudan started in 1995 when a man by the name of John Garang, who is known as the father and the founder of the nation, came to visit Sant-Egidio because at that time he was fighting in the bush in Sudan with a man named Riek Machar. And he came to Sant-Egidio for a series of confidential dialogues to try to find a way to make inroads for peace in his country, which was Sudan at the time. For a brief story or history of South Sudan, for those who might not know, the country was founded in 2011 as an independent nation, but unfortunately has been engaged in civil war ever since. The first civil war was in 2013, and there was a peace agreement called the Arxis, which was signed in 2015, which was supposed to set up a transitional government, a power-sharing government, but unfortunately that did not last long, and a second civil war broke out in 2016 and 2017. That war was technically ended when an agreement called the Arxis, which is the revitalized agreement to the 2015 agreement, was signed in 2018. One of the challenges with that agreement, however, was that there were groups, specifically groups that came from the SOA movement, which was the South Sudan Opposition Alliances movement, which found that the agreement was not inclusive, that it was not speaking to the needs of the South Sudanese. They had argued that it was an agreement that was forced upon them by Western actors and was not something that they were playing an active role in. And so you have a whole host of groups that did not sign the agreement. Unfortunately, what that means is that even though out of this agreement, we now had a transitional government, a power-sharing government, in which Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, which were the two men who were predominantly the ones who were leading the fighting in both of the civil wars, now had to share power as president and first vice president, and you had 4 additional vice presidents. Because you have groups that did not sign that agreement, those groups do not have to be held accountable to the standards and the agreements that were set forth in 2018. And so in 2019, as you can see a little bit in this picture here, Pope Francis and the Archbishop of Canterbury invited this new leadership of South Sudan, President Salva Kiir, First Vice President Riek Machar, and the other vice presidents, to Rome for something called a spiritual retreat. During this movement, he made a gesture that had never been seen before by a pope and that he has not done again, in which he knelt down and he kissed the feet of every single leader, imploring them to find a way and a path for peace in their country. And I like to show this photo because I think it's one of the most stark examples of true humility that we have, that to work for peace takes strength, but it also takes humility. And there's a great force in being able to say, for someone like the Pope who has so much influence, for the Holy Father to realize that perhaps the most powerful thing he could do in that moment, instead of yell and belittle people to work for peace, was to come down to this low level and to really almost beg them to make a difference in their country. And so, as a result of that, we, Sant-Egidio, were approached by the government of South Sudan and were asked to try to find a way to follow up on this request of Pope Francis. We have maintained contacts in South Sudan since that first meeting in 1995, because for us, as I mentioned, friendship is at the core of everything we do. And so our friendship with the churches and with the different governance structures and with these groups, these non-signatory groups in the 2018 agreement, were ongoing. We decided in tandem to find a way to facilitate a political dialogue between the non-signatory groups of the 2018 agreement and this new revitalized transitional government. These talks became known as the Rome Initiative. So the photo that you see here is taken at our headquarters in Rome, and it was from January 2020 when we launched it. And as I said, the idea of this process was to try to boost and bolster the inclusivity of the Peace Initiative by facilitating a political dialogue between the Artigonu, which is the revitalized transitional government of national unity, made up of those who signed the agreement in 2018, and at that time, what was the South Sudan Opposition Movements Alliance, which had sub-movements within it. And so here you can see this is the Hall of Peace. This is where the peace agreement in Mozambique was signed, and it's where we at least tried to start, if not have, most of our peace dialogues to this day. But we're fortunate that we try to get more and more people around the table, which means this room sometimes tends to be a bit too small these days. To offer you a brief overview, and I won't go into this just for the sake of time, but this is just to give you an understanding of some of the minutiae of the work that we've been doing in the Rome Initiative. That we're conducting a shuttle diplomacy, a bilateral dialogue, which means not only do we bring those two groups that I just mentioned, the R2GONU and the South Sudan Opposition Movements Alliance, together, but we also meet with them individually, because peace is an ongoing work. You need to continue to build up relationships. You also need to understand how to find those areas of commonality. And so it was launched in January 2020 with the signing of the Rome Declaration, and it was immediately followed up in February of 2020 with the signing of the Rome Resolution, in which we had found a way for the parties to try to engage in ceasefire monitoring and verification. Unfortunately, as we all know, what happened in March of 2020 with the global pandemic really had intense ramifications on peace work around the world, ramifications that we're still trying to fully understand. But for us, it meant that the in-person meetings could not take place, at least for a little bit of time. And we are quite old school as Sant-Egidio, but we really believe that there's an incredible power and necessity in being in person and encountering the other in person. And so, as you can see here, we were able to find a way to bring the talks back on target. The groups split amongst themselves in October 2020, which meant we had a bifurcated two-track political dialogue, that we would meet with one political opposition group and government representatives, then we would meet with the other political opposition group. Then we found a way to bring them all together in March 2023, after a long time of negotiation between the sides, finding a commonality. The phase that we now are in terms of the Rome Initiative, is something called the Tumaini Initiative, in which we now serve as co-mediators along with the government of Kenya. And this mediation is taking place as we're speaking in Nairobi. And the purpose is the same, to find a way to bring these non-signatories of the 2018 agreement into some form, not necessarily of agreement, but of governance structure with the current government, while also ensuring that the needs and the points raised by these non-signatories are really put to the forefront of the future of governance in South Sudan, and that both sides understand the challenges and frustrations of the other. And while I could spend more time going into that, something I want to spend the last few minutes here describing to you all is the work that we've been doing with civil society. Because I think oftentimes when we think of peace negotiation, we limit ourselves to only thinking of it as high level dialogues around a table, like the one you've just seen. And while it is critical and you need that work and you need the shell of diplomacy, more and more we're understanding that in order for a peace agreement to hold and to be sustainable, it has to not only be accepted, but really carried forth by the civil society, by the people of that country. Not only do they need to believe in it and be the ones advocating for it, but their needs and voices need to be integrated into it. And so we set out as a part of this new part of Sant-Egidio called the Sant-Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue. We tried to find a way to build in a civil society strategy to this high level political dialogue in South Sudan. And so we started in October 2021 by every time that we traveled to South Sudan, hosting workshops and listening sessions. The picture on the left is a group of young people, all leaders from the different churches in South Sudan. Because one thing we recognized is that in the country, there is an incredible spirit of ecumenism, which means that the 10 different denomination of Christian churches in South Sudan speak as one church, which is something don't even experience in Europe, and we definitely don't experience in the US. This gift of an ecumenical spirit for peace in South Sudan is a real gift that the world could learn for. And quite frankly, is one of the main reasons why the Pope, the Archbishop, and the moderator of the Church of Scotland decided to go to South Sudan in February of 2023. And so these are some of the youth there. And on the right is a group of Christian and Muslim women who have been praying and fasting for peace since the onset of the first civil war in 2013. We then began to work with a civil society artist and activist collective called Anataban, which means we are tired in Arabic. And we were able to put them in touch with these church coalitions because what we found on the ground is that when there is violence and conflict, especially a conflict that's rooted in ethnic tension, it becomes difficult to get to know your neighbor. And so, quite simply, one of the roles we thought we could perhaps play was by allowing people to get to know each other. And so, Anna Taban started to work with the churches to do these series of peace murals throughout this main city, Juba, the capital, all throughout different churches. And the one in the center is my favorite for a particular reason because it was painted on the road that the Pope drove by when he came in. And a couple weeks before he was there, President Salva Kiir stopped by and saw the mural and put his head out of the window of the car and smiled and waved. And I think it's an interesting question to beg of how much can art speak when it's really difficult to use words. Another thing that we tried to do, as I briefly just mentioned, is because South Sudan is a country that has unfortunately been embroiled in a lot of ethnic tension. There are 64 ethnic tribes and over 100 different languages spoken. And unfortunately, that has been used as a tool of manipulation by those in power to try to pin people against each other. And so we brought a group of diverse youth who are all based in the capital. Some of them go to university, some of them are in the church, some of them are based in the internally displaced camps in Juba, but they all come from different tribes. And we were able to take them to a community outside of Juba for 2 days for a peace retreat in which we reflected on the words of the Pope, the Archbishop, and the moderator. And we tried to find creative ways for them to break down barriers with each other. Here on the left, one of the things they did was they drew out a map of South Sudan, and in it, they put the word of peace in their local languages. And just as a short story of why, though this may seem simple, it actually makes a big difference. When we were getting ready to leave on the second day, one of the young men stood up and said, before he had come to this experience, he had been told that Equatorians, which is one of the tribes, eat people. And when he arrived the other day and realized that his roommate was an Equatorian, he thought he was going to have to sleep with one eye open. But he can now happily report that he was not eaten. And while everybody laughed, it began a rather serious conversation of how do we teach hatred and how do we teach otherness in our schools and in our homes? And how can we as young people not only push back, but how do we have to be the difference and the ones that push for inclusivity in our communities? Out of all this work, we were able to help foster and start a movement of youth that's still ongoing called the Youth Peace Pilgrimage. And it's made up of youth from the different churches throughout South Sudan, youth from Anataban, and from other civil society organizations who've come together to use the power of prayer and the spirit of peace to try to build a better future for their country. And this is a picture of the first large event that we did about 3 days before the Pope's visit. One of the things these youth peace pilgrimages do is something called an exchange learning program, in which they realize that although they are all part of the church, quote unquote, in South Sudan, many of them had never experienced a different faith tradition. They might be Catholic, but they'd never gone to a Protestant service, or they were Anglican, but had never gone to African inland. So they started going little by little, and they visited all of the different churches in Juba, in the capital, and they would come up with a topic of interest, whether it was gender equity, governance, justice, and accountability for crimes. And they would discuss it with each other, teach each other about their different spiritual traditions, but also their different ethnic traditions and the languages they speak, and maybe the communities that they had originally come from. Something that we launched this August, which was a first for us, was a mediation training in which South Sudanese, older South Sudanese, taught the young South Sudanese from the youth peace pilgrimages about what does it mean to do mediation and conflict resolution in a South Sudanese way. Something that we had encountered when we were going to South Sudan is that oftentimes you have really well-intentioned donors and larger organizations that come into places like Juba and try to have high-level trainings in a nice hotel and teach a lot of really strategic training materials. But at the end of the day, those things often don't work because they're not rooted and attuned to the local. And so we tried to flip it and say, instead of having us coming in from the outside, trying to dictate what somebody else should be doing in their own country, why don't we have nuns and sisters and professors and activists who have been on this front line, have lived through the war for years, try to teach the future generation about what it means to make peace in their country? And finally, the last event that I want to mention is this large interfaith and intercultural gathering that this youth peace pilgrimage group put on and hosted in the end of August in Juba. They're hopeful that this will become an annual event. And as we speak, the Youth Peace Pilgrimage Group is now trying to build out and find a way to mobilize this idea of ecumenical, interfaith, intercultural work for peace into the grassroots area. Because unfortunately, a lot of the violence that's happening now in South Sudan is on a grassroots level, an intercommunal violence. And so I will stop there and open it up for questions, and just want to reemphasize that thank you for this, and I'm grateful for you all taking the time.
Thank you very much for that wonderful overview of not just Sant-Egidio, but of the process in South Sudan. I welcome onto camera Holly and Ikra. If we start with Holly, if you could just each student introduce yourself a little bit and then ask your question. And if anyone who is watching has a question and you put it in the chat, if we have time, I will raise it.
Okay. Hi, my name is Holly. I'm currently a fourth year student at St. John's. I study global development and sustainability, and I hope to get my master's in international affairs and public policy.
Hi, my name is Ikra, and I'm currently a 2L. That's the second year law student at St. John's School of Law, and I am hoping to work in international field of law after graduation.
I guess I can start with the question. So first off, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that presentation, and your work on the ground in South Sudan is so, so important. And the work that your organization does sounds really, really great. That kind of community work in South Sudan really reminds me of like community-led development. And I'm just wondering, do you see a future for South Sudan where that civil society grows, and those voices can be strong enough to help end the conflict, as well as possibly even bringing those civil society voices to those high-level political discussions?
Thank you so much, Holly. That is a great question, and you're really at the forefront because a lot of people are thinking about that now. The government that is running the country right now is supposed to transition out in December. There were supposed to be elections a month from now, but that has now been postponed for another 2 years. And it's really thrown everybody into a big moment of questioning. Everybody, meaning not only the South Sudanese, but also the international community. Unfortunately, we live in a time where there are a myriad of conflicts around the world, and South Sudan is one of the very last on anybody's radar. And with the war in Sudan, things are only getting worse. And so, this question of what does it mean to build a culture of peace, I think really is going to fall to the people of South Sudan. Two examples that I think of, but are different because each context is wildly different, is one in Liberia with the work of Lema Gwobi and the Christian and Muslim Women's Peace Movement. I think that's really unique. There was a time when we were meeting with the women's group that I showed there, and I was mentioning this work that these women had done in which they had prayed and fasted and advocated and organized for years to try to push the men, because it was really only men at that time who were at the high level negotiation table, to really take it seriously. And they were ultimately successful in their work. But when I had mentioned it to these women in South Sudan, I think there was maybe just one who had heard about this example. So I think part of the challenge is, as I said, how do we, I think we as being from the West have a very, very privileged position, and we get to see things oftentimes from a 180 perspective. And I don't necessarily think it's our role to come in and change everything. I think it's our role to say, this is going on and this is great. There's also somebody over here. I think both of you would benefit from knowing each other, and then to step back. Another example, and you might know, is that the work in Sudan, the work for a democratic Sudan before the war broke out, was led by the people of Sudan. I don't think we're going to see something like that in South Sudan. The space for civil society is very small, and it's very much so under threat. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be fostered. I think the churches in South Sudan have a great history and legacy of working for peace for the sake of peace. And if we could continue to encourage that, continue encouraging young people to step in as advocates of peace and not wait for somebody else to take that up, then I really do believe that the future of the country, the peaceful future of the country, will rest in this community development work.
Thank you so much.
If I can ask a follow-up question to that, I when you were talking about the election being pushed back another 2 years, it really made me think of whether there are any international legal communities that are maybe using concepts of international law or just international pressure in general, if not law, that might be pushing for these things to not happen so often.
No, that's also a really good question, and you're going to be our future expert on it. So I'm excited for when you'll be in the field doing that work. What I know and what I've encountered, at least, is that people try to use targeted sanctions in different ways to, mostly visa sanctions, to allow for certain leaders not to travel. I will be honest, though, I think the application of international law has become rather difficult in South Sudan, because quite frankly, it's hard to understand what's going on. The country has never had a census, so there's no understanding of how many people are really there, where people are. Some different organizations are using geospatial technology to try to understand, but when the governance system can be very restrictive to people coming in from the outside, it makes it difficult to build up and follow international law. And there's work being produced now about how there might be a need for a discussion about how to memorialize the past. I think that's a big challenge that South Sudan has, that people are living out this trauma. There has been absolutely no healing from the trauma that they've experienced, whether it was during the war in Sudan and then became both of the civil wars in South Sudan. People tell stories when I go of how their family members were killed on the streets we're standing on now, but they don't know how or by who or when or where they're buried. So I think we definitely need to figure out a little bit better how to make people adhere to international law, but perhaps even equally with that, how do we take seriously this question of memorialization and speak honestly about the past and about what happened, and give people the space to speak from the past and to use the past to build a future that's going to look better than what had happened.
I also have another question. So when San-Egidio got involved with South Sudan, was there, a specific reason for that, or was it because you guys realized that the conflict was, ripe to be mediated with, or both sides were hurting. Kind of how was that, began, I guess.
I would say it was a little bit of the latter, that as I had mentioned before, we don't seek out conflicts. We're very pragmatic in the work that we do. That Sant-Egidio, 99% of what Sant-Egidio is what I mentioned before. It's living the spirit of the gospel in local communities in Boston, in New York, and Paris. So the diplomatic work ends up being a very small part of what Sant-Egidio is. So for very pragmatic reasons, we can't be engaged everywhere. South Sudan for us was different because, as I had said, we had been in contact with different leaders and communities since 1995. So that friendship continued. People had continued visiting Sudan, South Sudan. We built those relationships so that when the groups came in 2019, we were able to do our own internal reflection and realize, okay, we have enough of a relationship with both the government actors and the non-signatories, but also the international community, meaning the different embassies, the different UN agencies, different NGOs that are based there, that it made sense for us to say, let's try to play that role. And that's kind of also how we look at other places where we're engaging. We're very engaged in the Central African Republic, continue to be engaged in Mozambique, have done work in Senegal, Casamance, in Mali, and Burkina Faso, but it's always the same internal reflection of, are we ensuring that we're rooted in the point of view of the marginalized and that we can actually make a positive difference here, rather than just adding more confusion to a system that's unfortunately really overwhelmed with people that are trying to do good, but the peace system itself is really struggling with how many actors are engaged in certain conflicts.
Thank you for that. That was a good response, I think. And I also wanted to ask, just going back to that point on relationship building, um, do you often, and I know you touched on this, but do you often experience pushback from local communities? And if yes, then what are some ways that you've been able to bridge those gaps?
That's a really interesting question. Because as I said at the beginning, peace is a very dangerous thing, and I think we need to be honest about speaking about that. So Sant-Egidio intentionally does its work for peace in this way at a very confidential level. South Sudan is a bit of an exception, but we do that because we have experienced firsthand the loss and death of members of the community in areas of conflict. That's really how our work in Mozambique began, quite frankly. And so we never want to put our communities at risk because it's a family at the end of the day. So the high level work that we might be doing in Mali is not going to be shared with the local community there for that reason, that there needs to be a separation because peace is so dangerous, so fragile. In South Sudan, though, because the conflict is different, just like every conflict is, we realize that we can't now come in after two iterations of a civil war, two iterations of a peace agreement, and keep it completely closed off. There has to be some capacity of engaging with the local community. And it's been a good experience for us because we've had to deal really frankly with hearing pushback from people, but I think it's something that's healthy. And in an interesting way, because the groups that we work with, the non-signatory groups, cannot return to South Sudan, many of them, because they are in exile from the country, we are able to go to their home where they can no longer go. And we're able to hear frustration and things on the ground that they might not be able to hear. And vice versa, we can also share that with government leaders who often try to exclude themselves from that narrative. So I would say that we take it on as a privilege and something that's really welcomed to be challenged by the local community, to think differently about how we can be doing what we're doing, and to find a safe way to share those ideas, frustrations, qualms with the groups at the table without putting the local community at harm.
I want to jump in and ask one question, and then I'll give it back to Holly if she has another question. I want to ask about you to say a little bit more about the role of women. Right, we are all women on the panelists on this webinar, and I know from the classroom that those interested in peace, when I teach theologies of peace, it's overwhelmingly. But when we look at that high level room, I couldn't pick any out at looking around the table, or not that many. I once sat at a meeting at the United Nations where a young woman who had been involved, she had a medical student who had been involved in the Arab Spring, a young Egyptian Muslim woman got up and said, why is it, to the General Assembly, right? So these are all heads of state. Why is it that admission to the peace table seems to be a gun? And so I just wanted to ask, how does gender factor in, right? What the mobilizing and creating space for women, not just in the civil society aspect, but at the actual table. And then how do you navigate what it is to try and be somebody who's trying to mediate between, within a context where there's also not going to be a lot of other women in the room, never mind as negotiators and mediators?
Oh, that's a great question, Megan. I could go on for hours about that, and we all need each other is the short answer. We need to keep showing up in the spaces. But there is a real great hypocrisy that I saw even when I was doing my undergrad degree, because as I was mentioning at the beginning, we have this really horrible idea that peace equals weak and war equals strong. And I think in a really kind of westernized heteronormative sense that gets cut down to peace is feminine and war and conflict is masculine. And so at least my experience in undergrad, there were, I think, 2 men in the entire peace studies program, versus if you looked at the international security studies program, that was 80% men who were there. But now I'm doing peace, and there's no women who are around. So I wonder, how did we get from a space where we've codified the language of the study of peace and conflict as being quote unquote feminine and weak? But then when we get into the action of doing peace, not making peace, but of peace doing at an international level, it often relies on men and turns just to men. And I think it's something we really need to keep pushing for, that if we don't keep asking for it, people will not change who's in the room. We also do need to be realistic in that you need to have the people doing the harm in the room. And oftentimes that does mean that it's men, or it's armed groups or non-state armed groups that are run by men. But there are also women in those non-state armed groups. So also allowing women not to be just put in a box as all women are peace builders and peacemakers, because that's not necessarily true. Something that we did in South Sudan is we've been pushing since the beginning that that table, that picture that I showed you in 2020, cannot be the way that that table looks in 2024. And so the last time that we had high level negotiation, not only us from Sant-Egidio with myself being involved on the international community, but also both of the non-signatories and the government, we had women representatives on all 4 sides of the table. And a way for us of doing this safely is also doing the civil society work, being with women. And then when I get the chance, and when the other mediators from Sant-Egidio have the chance to speak with the non-signatories and the government, raising at the forefront the fears and concerns and ideas of women is really important. Because again, we have this privileged position, but it's not enough to just have the position. We need to really keep pushing. So I would say I get strength in doing it by meeting other people my age, younger, and those who came before me who have done this work. And I think we need to keep showing up in those spaces, because the space is not going to be made for you. You just need to be there and keep fighting to be there, and would encourage anybody who's interested in this path to keep doing that work.
That was like really beautifully answered. I think also kind of that points to narratives and the way things are, seen as either through media or just in society. So very good answer. I did have a question. I was wondering, for future events in South Sudan with the civil society work, do you guys have set times? Like, do you say like, okay, something every month, or the next event will be then, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, no, it's very fluid and flexible, as one of our key tenets are, because um, we don't want to be the ones dictating what a solution of peace for South Sudan looks like for the South Sudanese, and we've done that on purpose. I think there are groups that take that approach, and it works for them, and I think it does work in some settings. I think in South Sudan that doesn't work anymore. So right now I was on the phone this morning with our colleagues from the youth program in South Sudan, and we were talking about what does the future look like. And I would say this to anybody who's listening. I think especially right now, it can feel really difficult to look at the world and ask, what can we be doing to help? And Holly, you asked a great question about is the future potentially community-led development? I think it is. I think it's mutual aid, and I think it's investing in communities around us. So for those of you who are interested in South Sudan and would want to learn more, I'd be happy to not only speak after this, but to put you in touch with the youth who are there. Things that we do from the US is we have a monthly prayer for peace in South Sudan that we run through Sant-Egidio, but we also keep in touch on a daily basis because it's friendship. But I think a lot can be done at the grassroots level, and a group like these youth could use groups of youth from around the world who would believe in them and walk with them on this path for peace, because it's lonely to do it alone. So I would encourage anyone who is interested in learning about that more, feel free to follow up. I can talk about South Sudan for days, but more importantly, my friends who are there and who have lived through it can really offer some great guidance, advice, and I think also hope for all of us in these times that can be a little bit challenging.
I have a question, and this is more, I think, on a personal level, but as a mediator working in such high tension environments, do you have any thoughts on compassion fatigue? And then if yes, like how are you able to deal with that?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I've never thought about it in that way before. I feel really lucky to be able to do the work that I'm doing in the capacity of Sant-Egidio because, as I'd mentioned, we're a community rooted in prayer. And on a personal level, I'm Catholic, and for me, prayer and living out the gospel is the way I do my life. That this work for peace for me, as I've mentioned, it's not just a job. I see it as something vocational, which can also run the risk of a fatigue or a burnout, that language that we use a little bit more. But for me, this rootedness in prayer is so important, that there's something um, really unique about being able to do 10 hours of negotiation here, walk across the street to the Basilica, and sit with my colleagues and friends and have 30 minutes in prayer. And it's really this rooted moment that says, this is the very little that I can be doing. And I'm trying to serve a greater purpose. I'm trying to work towards a greater good, but I'm also not alone in this work. And I think that's what helps break that down. And for me as a Catholic, reading the gospel is important because I think Jesus could be the person to be experiencing a lot of compassion fatigue, that he was always with those on the margins. And I would hope I could be as strong as that. I don't know if I don't think I'll ever reach that level. But being able to go back to prayer and to remind myself, okay, there is an example to follow, but there's a bigger community of people out here who are doing this, and I'm not alone in this work, has personally been really, really rooted for me and has allowed me to continue doing this work at this level.
Thank you for that. Holly, did you have another question? If not, I can.
I don't.
You can ask your question, and it'll be the last question, Ikra.
Okay, got it. Just going back to your work with the UN, can you just speak a little bit more about how it is as an organization working with an international organization, and how that interacts with working with the Sudanese government?
So for us, it all boils down to that idea of synergy, of what can we offer them and vice versa, that will make this a really productive friendship, but also more so working relationship. And the UN is an interesting example. We have consultative status there, but we really engage on bilateral levels on topics of mutual interest. So whether that be South Sudan or Central Africa or different conflicts that are really of great interest to them. I'll give the two specific examples. One I already gave at the beginning, which is that in the Central African Republic, we work with the UN to basically help do their DDR strategy, because while they have all of the knowledge and the know-how and the power and the resources, Sant-Egidio has been present as the community for many years there. So they know the local needs, they know where people are, they know how people are going to respond to things. So that's a really synergetic partnership that works for us and works for them. Another example was in Ukraine. So we have had communities in Ukraine and Russia for 30 years. So from the immediate onset of the conflict, there has not only has there not been a stop in the work that we do, but there's been an incredible increase in services to the homeless, to people in elderly homes that were abandoned, to people who are on dialysis that we have to re-evacuate. When you think of conflict, you don't think of those people who have nowhere else to go and who are going to be forgotten. So at the beginning of the conflict, the World Food Program, which is also a big part of the UN, the big UN system family, had all of these vouchers that they wanted to give out. And it was going to be food vouchers where people could present them and then get packs of food. But they had no idea how to access the local communities. They didn't know who need them. They didn't know how to find these people. But since we had been there for 30 plus years and we're already running weekly distributions of food, we knew exactly how to do it. So then we worked with them. They gave us the vouchers and we did the outreach and the programming. So that's kind of, we try to work with them in maybe creative could be a word for it, creative ways of realizing what our strengths are and what their great strengths are. And then when it comes to South Sudan, you know, we were lucky to be asked to present to the UN Security Council 2 summers ago to speak about the work that we were doing. We have an incredible relationship. South Sudan is one of the countries that has a UN mission based there. So every time we go to the country, we get the chance to meet with a couple of times the the high representative who's there, the special representative, the Secretary General. But then we also meet with political officers and people who are working in the fields. The UN is a vast system, which is beautiful and incredible and has the capacity to do a lot of good. And I think smaller organizations and groups like Sant-Egidio can help the UN be the UN by providing them with some nimbleness that larger bureaucracy makes more difficult.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Elizabeth. Thank you to our students for a wonderful presentation, but really a wonderful conversation with some great questions. I was struck as you were talking about just how much of an overlap in terms of you see a similar kind of inspirations and approaches that come when things are faith-based, and that cuts across. And as you were talking about prayer, I was thinking about the ways in which kind of in interfaith peace efforts, right, it's the kind of the prayer among the communities and between the communities plays such an important role in navigating what comes next. And so I think it's really a beautiful example. I want to thank everyone who watched and who will watch on YouTube, and hope that you will join in our webinars to come. There is one tomorrow that is a student-led conversation by my co-chair, Dana Livingston, focused on selective outrage and how we navigate. We saw today how South Sudan is an example of one really dire situation that gets almost no coverage and almost no attention kind of globally, when there are so many what gets our attention and how in terms of what is really a kind of sometimes there are good reasons and sometimes bad reasons for why it is that people are very, very concerned about one crisis and not concerned about others, as well as others that you can find archived on our YouTube channel. This in particular program has been part of our cooperation and collaboration as part of St. John's marking International Education Week. And so once again, I thank everyone for watching, and hopefully I can say all of us will join with you in prayer for peace in South Sudan. Thank you.